Hi, Scout.
Hello.
So I'm here with Scout Rainer Wiley, and yeah, we've been friends for a couple, if not 3 years, on the internet. And yeah, it's been a long time coming. This conversation for me, as you're someone who I feel embodies so much of the creative spirit in lots of different domains. And yeah, I want to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself, but I'll
Hmm.
also say how the things that come to me when I think of you. And so there's this poetic part. There's a sort of, yeah, you're a poet. There's even an aspect of like the fool or the mischief maker in a lot of stuff that you do. And yeah, and broadly speaking, an artist. I feel like the spirit of an artist is so present in everything that you do. uh you're a thinker. I think you're incredibly eloquent and sharp in a lot of the way, and an original thinker as well. There's a lot of stuff that I I'm intrigued about when I hear you speak about it. You can really sense that there's an original and unique perspective that you bring to lots of things. Um, yeah, and then also ritual and religion is a big part of things that seem very important to you. And I think, and the muse and how all of that weaves into your creative process, I think is something that will definitely come through as as we have this conversation. But yeah, uh, as a chance to introduce yourself to the listeners, who are you, Scout?
Oh dear God. Where do I begin? Yeah. Well, I'll start by saying how interesting it is to um have yourself be reflected back to yourself from someone who it's a weird time, right? To have because we have this thing called internet friends in these weird times. So you can have someone who knows you, but there's such a distance, there's such a gap. And it's not that they don't know you. Sometimes I get caught up in this, like, you don't know me, you just know me from the internet. But there is something to be said about observing someone over time and watching their work. But they're not quite a celebrity, so you have this parasocial relationship with them, but they aren't necessarily a celebrity. So it's very interesting to have myself reflected back to myself in that way, and then have that a follow-up be like an invitation of like, so who are you, Scout? And I'm just like, I was I live with a housemate who is like a very devout practitioner, insight practice, and he studied various spiritual traditions, and um, he was leading a meditation group, and we were talking about emptiness or no self, and I was like, oh yeah, no, that one I can understand that one. Because when I think about myself, I'm like almost always going into a negation of self. When I think about myself, I think of a I could say I'm an independent religious scholar, and that's true, but it's also not who I
Mm-hmm.
am. It's a thing that I do. So I would say the things that I do, the acts that I perform, emergent ritual practice, poetry, prose poetry more specifically, and free verse poetry as well, devotional song offerings, and or singer-songwriter stuff, divination, all of the whimsical, magical performance, sort of gestury things as well. And yeah, in search of the true but partial, um, as well, is what I would say.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I'm a fan of philosophy, but I also deeply hate it. For reasons I'm sure I don't need to explain to anyone, if you're familiar, in particular with the Western philosophical tradition. But I would say all philosophies have a juicy, interesting piece of the puzzle, and my mercurial mind is sort of dissatisfied with sticking to just one, and so I do kind of bounce around, sometimes in polarized camps, in order to explore all these little these perspectives on an unfathomable reality. It's one of my many hobbies.
Yeah. No, I love that. And what I'm sort of picking up on there as it relates to being creators is that question of who are you? I mean, I don't know how anyone can really answer that. And, and so often it comes to what it is that we do. And that's more what we're talking about. And then when it comes to philosophy as well, I think one of the fascinating things and what I hope to kind of explore and imagine I'll uncover is that creating is very different from philosophizing, and so there's
Mhm.
lots of stuff that we like to draw upon as inspiration, as kind of content, things that we like to weave into our work. But it's a very different pursuit trying to come up with truth rather than just creating and expressing. And
Mhm.
yeah, I think, and again, with that sort of no self thing, it's like you can be a vehicle for so many different things, and it shifts depending on what it is you're focused on bringing into being.
Mhm. Well,
So I'm
yeah, there's already so much in what you just shared that I could just go off on, but sounds like you had a question. So
yeah, well, I'm sure it'll all come back round, but I kind of wanted to
yeah.
go back to a little bit of your beginnings, the origin of being creative,
Mm.
and especially, so one thing that comes through with a lot of kind of intuitive creatives is that they have this really rich imaginative life, and that's been with them for a long time, and it can be very non-linear and difficult to fit into quite a linear society in some regards, and holding, and yeah, so I'm just kind of curious to get a picture of what it was like for you growing up, as how you would describe your what it looked like to be a creative person or an expressive person.
Mm.
And feel free to speak about your family as well. Like, I
Mhm.
know that you had a podcast with your dad that I listened to a bit of,
Oh,
and
wow.
he's a dancer and into hip
Yeah,
hop and stuff. So that was really
right.
interesting. So just getting a sense of like, oh wow, you grew up kind of
Mm.
in New York in this kind of with this kind of
Mhm.
family. So yeah, I'd love to
Mhm.
just hear about
Mhm.
what that looked like and what creating looked like when you were younger, and whether it was mostly expressive but didn't find so much form, or there was always some form to the creativity rather than just kind of exploring.
Mhm. Oh, I like this question. It's nice and specific. So I was raised by two Afrocentric hippies, excuse me, by two Afrocentric hippies, in New York City, surrounded by practitioners of like very at the time in the States obscure form of dance, which is house dance. Um, and I also grew up around people of various backgrounds. I had a very diverse village context that I grew up in, surrounded by, and this is likely why, in terms of my magical practice, I am a syncretist. I like to blame, I like to blame my parents' friends for why I'm so all over the place with my practice. When I was a kid, I didn't have very many friends because of the unique context that I was being raised in at the time. It was very different from, because I had these hippie Afrocentric parents who were surrounded by different practitioners of various religious traditions. One of my godmothers was a practitioner of various African diasporic religions. And then I had godfathers who are practitioners of African diasporic religions, like totally different ones. And uh, kids at school were nothing like that. They were pretty, more into the mainstream. Some of them went to like Baptist church and stuff like that. So I was just very, it was hard for me to connect to people my own age, but my best friend in throughout elementary school was almost always my teacher, um, or a book that that teacher gave me. And the characters within those books. So I sort of built a rich imaginal world at a young age. Um, I don't like to pathologize it, but I will admit that it probably had to do with escaping from the loneliness. But I will say that it also had to do with neurodivergences. I think I probably would have had an incredibly rich imaginal world, regardless of whether or not I had friends, but that imaginal world was my escape in some respects. I used to like talk to fairies and spirits and all of these things, and because of my parents and how open-minded they were to that kind of content, due to their own interests, religious interests, they were, you know, um, they weren't dismissive of it necessarily, although obviously they didn't live in that world with me. But a lot of my creative drive came from early childhood visionary experiences, like strange dreams and like visitations and apparitions and voices and all of that would come through, and I would creatively express most of my creative expression up until age 11 was through dance. And later in life, I started to get into music and poetry after my harrowing experiences at college, which of which I will not speak. So much like myself as an adult, I was a little bit all over the place and really intimate with chaos and emergence and visionary, intense visionary experience has always been a part of my life. And so that's really my primary creative inspiration is what do I do with this other reality that I can't seem to get away from? Well, it has to go somewhere. And it just intuitively, in part because my mother is a painter. She's an abstract expressionist, more specifically. And my father is a dancer, a dance teacher, fitness instructor, and so instructor. And so I'm being raised at the intersection of visionary and expressive forms of I would refer to it as channeling. You know, they always would say their art doesn't feel like it comes from them. They would open some sort of they would describe it in a very spiritual way as some sort of portal opens. They go into a trance and it flows through them. And so I was predisposed to this intersection of the religious and spiritual and philosophical and the creative. One of my best teachers is Josh Fry. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but one of the things that he teaches is cultivating a bardic vessel, how to become the place where inspiration can come and live and sit and move through. And how do we empty ourselves? This goes back to the no self content as well. How do we empty ourselves so that whatever wants to come through us can actually come through us? It's very different from how we think artists are, which is like there's a stereotype that artists are egoic and self-absorbed and yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's so many places to take all of that, but you know, it's so interesting because I think the key thing that comes through often there is where is the focus, and when the focus on this is on the self, it's quite hard to let anything come through because you know it's a different thing rather than even in that description of being a channel. It's, I mean, you can almost imagine like where does the energy channel through if the focus is back on itself? The only way you can kind of open the channel is by pointing it somewhere, you know.
Yeah, it's like a jar with a lid on it. Sometimes that lid needs to be on the jar so the contents don't spill out, but how are you going to drink the water?
Right.
If this lid stays on, you know.
Yeah. And I also really like this picture of you growing up, and there's, I think, that experience of rich imagination, neurodiversity, just chaos, chaos, a lot of chaos, and like what to do with that. And then the picture of your parents, of one having physical expression and the other being a visual artist, and the way that those two things, I mean, the thing that's so great about painting, if you like, in whichever form, that it really has these frames. There's these constraints that are really built into the practice. And I I'm sort of curious as we go on to see where those constraints have arisen in your life, because there's this, I think, as creators, of intuitive people, as kind of people used to dancing with chaos, we start to ask these questions of like, how am I going to make this work? And that, and that sort of question is getting at, how am I going to make this work as a, broadly speaking, like a career? How am I going to do something with this? And that becomes its own creative process, you know?
Yeah.
And it sounds like both of your parents found a way to make it work for them. And there are kind of these limits of like, your dad's a dance instructor and a fitness instructor, and a way to kind of pour all of that expression into something that has edges, that has its picture frame, that, you know um so yeah, kind of picking up from that, you're kind of familiar with chaos. It sounds like you're there's music, there's dance, there's speaking with fairies, there's all sorts of stuff happening. When did, or maybe speak to asking yourself that question of, and however it came to you, but I imagine it was some form of like, okay, so what am I going to do with this,
Yeah. Where to even start with all of that? It's a really rich question. You're kind of speaking about, this is the core of my work with others, my service work actually, is the necessity of that chaos, and in terms of being I like that you use the term creative intuitives, because that's the term that I use as well to describe these kinds of people who have a relationship to the creative force similar to, and I feel that you and I have a very similar relationship to the creative force, though we might use slightly different terms and describe it in different ways. But people who, you know, are open channels for that chaos and can hold that chaos, or can regulate through that chaos, or just invite that chaos by the nature of being intuitive and creative people. Why the relationship between art and ritual is so important if you're going to be a creative guide, it's so important to remind people, to bring people back to that, because the ritual is the container in which the right. So if the creative force is the water, the ritual container is the jar. And without that, you just have a puddle on the floor. So for myself, once I started to get very serious about ritual practice and ritual containment, with
Oh.
artistic way, when one doesn't have containment, we see it all the time with artists in the public eye. They're sort of, their lives unravel, they fall prey to things like addiction, or a lot of relational drama, and people feed off of watching their downfalls. I remember last year when Sinead O'Connor died, one of her final sort of public appearances was her just pleading for help and support. This 50-something-year-old woman who devoted herself to being so outspoken, honest, and just a pure channel for what she felt was authenticity, and struggling to find that container, regardless of, it seemed like she tried pretty hard. And so we need these containers in order for our artistic creative fires to be to not be destructive towards ourselves and others, is what I would say, and
Mm.
how I've found that is has been useful for me and for others is by ritualizing. And I like to say ritualizing. I personally am a fan of religious practice, and I'm a syncretist, and I'm hungry for the intersection of the logos, mythos, and pathos, right? So the pathos is like the experience that we have and how we feel about it, and the logos being the philosophy, and then the mythos being the stories, right? And religions tend to contain all three of those, so I'm very passionate about them. But for the secular, for the people that have religious trauma, or it just doesn't resonate with them, they don't see the value in it. Ritual practice is, I would argue, potentially even more of a necessity, or at least being aware of how you already ritualize your life. We are predisposed to these kinds of actions, and creative people specifically need them. This is how we don't
Yeah.
lose our minds effectively.
Yeah, maybe if you could speak to how ritual in the way you see it may actually already be sort of in people's lives. I think this is a
Mm,
take you had. Well, it's one of the things that stood out to me is how you kind of acknowledge how ritual is already present and it's kind of working with what's already there, which I think is so important in any creative endeavor. Is actually we're always working with something that's already present to some degree anyway.
mhm.
It's
Yeah,
quite
well said.
rare in life that it's like it's there, and when we're not observing that it's there, then it can really feel, well, we're not in reality, and we start to have, it's like we're fighting against ourselves, and I
Mm,
think there's so much struggle in a lot of creative, intuitive people's lives, because it's like, oh, how do I do anything with this? And I think focusing on those small seeds where it's already present and we can start to just sort of nurture what's already there
mm,
can, is a way that like a surprising amount of, I don't know, growth or creation can occur um, when we work with what's there. So yeah,
mhm,
any thoughts on ritual and how people might identify it in their lives already?
mhm. Yeah, let me see if I can make this succinct, because I have maybe too many thoughts about it, which is why my entire life and work actually revolves around it. Because I feel like
Yeah.
I could just probably explore this for the rest of my life, and likely will. And I'm 29 too, so it's like we're just getting started. um, um, so my perspective on ritual is very influenced by the work of John Vervaeke, you might know of, or who your listeners might know of. If they don't, I highly recommend his work. He's brilliant, and he puts so much work out there for free that most people, in order to access the sort of content that the quality of content, you would have to pay $40,000 a year to
Mm,
go to college to
yeah.
access, and he just puts it all out there for free. So I'm very grateful for that, for him, and the quality of his work. But he's a cognitive scientist, and he's also like a qigong practitioner, and uh, philosophy scholar, and whatnot. And um, my perspective on ritual is kind of based on his understanding of ritual being this emergent property of an advancement in human cognition. So there comes a point, I believe it's the upper Paleolithic period, right, where we just start doing cave paintings and creating ceremonies for our dead, and art and ritual kind of emerge simultaneously as these expressions of this advancement in our cognition, and how we perceive the world, and then our behavior as a result of that. And so on the one hand, that's a little bit of a disappointing answer, because you're like, oh, we do it because we do it. We do it because we're human, right? It's kind of like, why do we love?
Hmm.
Well, right? Because we're fucking mammals. And and mammals fall in love, right? And they display affection and they bond and they groom each other, and they all, we make art and we perform rituals. And so the ways in which we can identify how our lives are already ritualized as we look at the characteristics of ritual. And so this perspective comes from the work of Catherine Bell, who is a well-known religious scholar in like academia that I accidentally sort of stumbled upon many years ago and have just became a little obsessed with, because I just love the way that she categorizes ritual actions in a way that shows how mundane they are. So we have repetition, we have a sort of what appears to be a rigidity, right? So we'll perform the same action in the same way or similar ways. We'll defer to tradition in some way. Oh, this is the way it's always been done. It makes us feel connected to the past, and it makes us feel like there's some sort of continuity in our lives. And so this can be as simple as I like my coffee. I'll use this as an example of how I like my coffee in the same mug. I like to journal while I'm having it. I like
Right.
to make it the same way. I like to put the exact same amount of honey in it. And sometimes I'll even get as rigid as I can with how I stir it or how many times I stir it. And what I like to do is like go outside on my porch or lay in the grass and have my coffee and journal and listen to the crows, and and there's a sacredness to it. My journal is a sacred object. It's a grimoire. It's a magical item. My coffee mug is a sacred object. It's imbued with the life that I enchant it with my actions, and I can feel that somatically as well. Josh Fry learned this from his practice in the Indian traditions, which he's been practicing for basically his whole life, which is that myths live in bodies. And I take that
Hmm.
and kind of twist it and say, yeah, the rituals live in our bodies too. And so the more we are willing to observe our bodies, right? And their natural predisposition to these repetitive actions, to this feeling of the sacred that we have in our lives, we'll start to find the rituals that are already there, and we can actually become more conscious with them. Start to invite more of what we want, and start to not just to sort of perform them, but to create them.
Yeah. So this is a question that arises for me personally. So I definitely have some rituals, but not many. And that's kind of part of my
I'm
chaos.
sure you have more than you think you do.
Yeah. And I would imagine there are too, but definitely hearing the way you describe this coffee ritual in the same mug, this is so far away from my experience. And
Mm.
and I'm wondering how much of that for you was kind of, it sort of naturally emerged like that, and you realized like, oh wow, look, I've actually got quite a refined ritual here. And how much was it an act of creation, of realizing like, oh, actually there's something going on here, and
Mm.
I'm going to take it to another level of refinement and really kind of make something of it. And then second to that, what does that do for you as an artist? I mean, there's art already taking place in that, but I'm wondering
Mm.
if that's also an element to the rest of your creative process, in the way a day might unfold or that kind of thing.
Mhm, mhm. So, I'll start by saying that I didn't always do things this way. I reached a point, I struggled with mental health a lot, especially as a teenager. And I reached a bit of a breaking point, and it was in that breaking point that I hit a little bit of a rock bottom when I was around at 18, 19, and uh, hit a second rock bottom. Like I didn't think it could get worse, but it did, around 21. And it was in this span of time that I started reading tarot, and trying to create some sort of order or structure in my life. And I didn't do it healthily, right? I just like started like I started like having disordered eating and all of this stuff. But I now see, when I look back on that, I now see that that was a manifestation of the threshold of how much chaos I could handle, and how my psyche would naturally, when it hit that point, search for some sort of ritual container. So I actually, what I said earlier about the rituals being already there and them being a part of our cognition, I understand this on an abstract level, but I actually also experienced the truth of it in the way that I didn't need to try to begin to come into a ritualized life, because things got so bad that it's almost like my survival instincts kicked in to try to keep me alive, and my survival instincts said, we've survived through ritual as humans, so this is where we're going to go with it. So that's sort of the first half of your question. The second half of your question, there's a little bit of a double question there. But I don't remember the second part. It was intriguing though. Would you mind repeating it?
Yeah. So it was, so this coffee ritual, it has its own.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is it an element in the way, does it lead on to something else that is this a fundamental part of the rest of your day as a creator?
Well,
And
the
or
journaling.
do you even see it like that? Maybe
Yeah.
it's just in isolation.
Well, I don't tend to see anything in isolation. Less and less am I seeing things in isolation. I see things. I won't use interconnectedness because that's a little bit of a buzzword, and I don't think separation these days is getting its due diligence. Which is a little bit of maybe a spicy opinion.
Let's just double click on that for a second.
Sure.
Or a few minutes. That's fine too. But
Okay.
because this is actually I think separation is also so valuable to us as creators, and I'm curious to know why you say that.
Yeah, absolutely. In meditation recently, for the phrase that was revealed to me was that it's the chasm of yearning that leads you home, right? Because yearning is a pull, it's a tug from the heart towards something. And I sort of subscribe to this ontology that comes from process philosophy, which is my understanding of our reality is that it is not static, it is seeking itself. And so how can we, if we are truly interconnected, we must also be separate, because what are we seeking if there's not something beyond, right? And this is why creativity, this is why creation or a creative force exists in the first place, because what are you creating if everything is already static, right? How can there be verbs? How can there be a towardness or an aboutness? As Terence Deacon says, an aboutness can't be there if everything's already perfect and static and complete, right? So this incompleteness is the creativity, I would argue, or it's an important factor of it at least. Yeah, if that makes sense.
It's a dynamic. Yeah, it's
right.
Yeah. In the work that I do, there's always, or the way that we would describe it at least would be that any creative process has reality as it currently is, and then this desired state so when you describe seeking itself, it's like, what is that? And as soon as you establish some sort of vision, and it is in relationship with what is, but it's not there yet, and that immediately creates this dynamic, and there's a creative tension to be resolved there, and it can be resolved, and then it'll create itself again.
Right.
There's something quite
yeah,
there's something quite.
Is I would argue that resolution is boring. Once we get there, we're like, have you ever completed a project and gotten depressed? I'm sure you have.
Well, it's such an interesting thing. I think this is such a sort of curious ground, because if you never complete projects, then you also get depressed.
Right. Yeah.
And it's sort of,
So true. Yeah.
it becomes a question of like, well, what is this really about?
Mhm.
And if we sort of look at, well, it's not about becoming anyone, because I'm not anyone in the first place. It's not about, it's
Right.
not about gratifying me, because nothing outside of me is ultimately a form of gratification that
Mhm.
lasts, and it's also not about the process if the process doesn't create, and if it doesn't create something,
Mhm.
and I think it can be, but actually it's all of those things. And I think that's
Mhm.
something that's so, well, when I hear you speak of ritual, the pictures that come up, when you talk of burial, you talk of art on the cave wall, you talk of, well, really, and then we have plays, and we have, everything is, even going to a theater, I mean, there's so much ritual in all of that. And the
Mhm.
structure, the container for humans to express themselves, it's bound up in this thing that we call a play, you know
Mhm.
and it doesn't last, like a meal doesn't last. It's
Mhm.
like, oh, I had breakfast this morning and I'm already hungry by lunch. What a disappointment. It's like, that's not kind of the point. It's like we create, and then it disappears, and then we create again, and then it disappears. And I think one of the main things that I'm interested in exploring is, well, in this work, is I think artists have a great way of revealing that to us. I think the the least proficient we are as creators, the more likely we are to think that something can do something for us in like an ultimate sense, that it's going to save us, or if and this could be anything. It could be, oh, if I create my business, I'm going to finally feel worthy about myself, or and yet the
Mhm.
business is just like a poem, and if you're successful, and even if it takes many years, it will be what it is, for as long as for as long as you want to keep doing that thing, and it will serve a purpose. But it's all very transient, and I think that the message
Mhm.
behind creating is that we can create, like we can
Mhm.
make plays, we can dance, we can sing, we can create songs, and some of them it is a challenge. It's
Mhm.
actually difficult for us to, well, it's often difficult for us to create at the level of our aspirations. And so a lot of the time we're kind of falling short, and that seeking of itself is not quite realizing itself. And then it does, and then the aspiration
Mhm.
changes. So
Mhm.
there's just a lot of movement and fluidity, I think,
Mhm.
in a creative process that is embraced for its own sake, rather than,
Mhm.
you know, rather
Yeah.
than for trying to solve life, or, you know, make
Mhm.
society a better place. It may do all of those things as a consequence, but when it's, I I mean, words like pure can be a bit dangerous, but I think like there's something, when you strip everything away, a creative process for its own sake can look and feel incredibly clean.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah,
Mhm.
lots there. If there's anything you want to riff off particularly, then
Sure.
run
I
with it.
mean, for me personally, it ties to meaning, purpose, and service, all of which are entwined in my understanding. And when I look at the people that I know of that seem the most fulfilled, that is what is central to their lives and the way they live their lives. So meaning, something that we must generate constantly, something that is constantly shifting and moving, because it is so highly subjective, and yet we all need it and we all experience it, we all look for it. Service, being beyond the self, but also like getting to be the self. So getting to be the self that is beyond the self, and purpose. Like what am I here to do, right? And so for myself, all of that comes through, and like I exist to serve the beautification of the world and to admire the beauty of the world, which is common, I would argue, I mean, I wouldn't argue, there's no reason to argue, but I would argue in the more neutral sense, as in I would advocate for this position, which is that most people who identify as artists, who are devoted to being artists, that is what they do. They serve the beautification of the world. They know where the beauty in the world is. Oftentimes they can find the beauty in the places where most others can't, where most others would reject, right? Some of my favorite artists are like Elliott Smith and Nick Cave, right? And I follow Nick Cave's Red Hand Files. And one of the issues of the Red Hand Files that stood out to me was when the Red Hand Files is essentially people can ask Nick Cave a question and he'll write a newsletter answering the question if he finds it intriguing.
Got you.
And they asked about his son who died. I believe his son's name was Arthur. And asked about, this person had also lost a child and was like, does this pain ever go away? And Nick Cave was like, of course it doesn't go away, but it's profoundly holy. And if you're, it's he was talking about the profound blessing that is grief and the ability to grieve, because it shows that you've had the ability to love, that you've been given the gift of love. And so some of the greatest artists are, people, and Elliott Smith, he was a great artist, couldn't make peace with his grief, with his pain. Ultimately, it did consume him, but his art, he still managed to create something beautiful, even though it did consume him in the end. And so you're being asked to transmute, to be an alchemist when you're an artist, and you do it on behalf of the world, because a lot of people do not have that capacity, and that's okay. Not everyone, is meant to do. We're not all meant to have the same skills and do the same things in this life. We each have specific roles to play, and we're each parts of a grand whole. And so the artists were meant to transmute the profound pain of the human experience into something beautiful. Sort of like the I sometimes jokingly refer to myself as the patron saint of rats, because rats are these prey animals that are very underappreciated, but what they actually do for the ecosystems, what they do for the whole, by being prey animals, by being food for these other animals, is it like this beautiful sacrifice. And
yeah.
you know what I mean? And I feel that way about all parts of reality, even like, it's tick season over here, and as I'm like throwing the ticks into the I was pulling these ticks off I went to go get some rosary beads, and I don't have a car, so I had to walk up like a pretty long distance to go get the rosary beads. And as I was walking along not the highway, but like the roadside, I was passing through like profoundly tick infested area, and I come back home. This is right before I shaved my head too. It's a very dramatic and hilarious story. I got back home, I shaved my head, and as I'm shaving my head, I'm pulling all these ticks off of my body and throwing them into the toilet water and flushing them and saying thank you as I'm flushing, saying thank you for existing, but I need to kill you now because that's how I'll survive. And saying thank you for the experience of defending my own life, and still honoring the life of the being that I'm needing to obliterate in order to preserve my own life. And that's what the artist is here to do, is to have those challenging experiences and create stories from them and share them with the world. So not sure if that answers your question at all. I just kind of went with what was coming through. So.
Yeah, no, this is all good. I'm curious to see if we go back a little bit to, I mean, just in the time that I've known you, you've started a Substack. There was a podcast that was a part of that. And some of these things you may have been doing prior as well, but there's the facilitation work that you do, and which involves, well, it sounds like a little bit of what you're talking about, kind of helping people find and create rituals and connect to artistic creative forces in their lives and express them in ways. Um, there was an album of yours that I listened to, or a small EP of sorts.
Yeah.
So these are really like these are creations with some edges. You know, your Substack, it lives in its little place on the internet, and you've got a website. And what was it? I'd love to hear about what it was like for you to go from ex- having all of this stuff inside of you, but then creating creations, not just creativity and intuition, but really creating creations that you can kind of point people to. There's my Substack and there's my album.
Mm.
Because I think that's one of the things that challenges a lot of people that have a lot of chaos. It
Mm.
can't find any, it's like those little jam jars. And these are sort of in the way that creations are separate. Your Substack is connected via you, but it's separate from your musical piece, and
Mm.
it's separate from the work that you do. And once upon a time, none of these things existed. You brought them into being in the way that you have. Um, so yeah,
Mm.
speak to that kind of process of going from being creative to making creations.
I love that because it reminds me of another poetic phrase that came to me in meditation a while back, which is we're not just creators, we're creation. Um, and what I think that's, I mean, I've been contemplating it for a while, but what I think that really means is that when you, well, first of all, I don't think people realize how actually virtuous it is to create something and offer it to the world. I think a lot of people get tripped up in thinking that it's about them, and then because they don't want it to be about them, which congratulations, it's not. So you don't have to worry about that anymore. They think it's about them. Well, they actually, I should rephrase that. They think it's about what they reduce themselves to. So what they think is them. So it's about
Mm.
them, but it's about such a bigger part of them that is a part of a thing that's bigger than that part of them even. So um, going from being creative, right? So you can have an idea and you can be creative with your ideas, and all of that is wonderful, but it takes a number of virtues to actually make it into an offering to the world, right? So you have to be courageous. You have to be willing to, it's incredibly vulnerable to have a Substack, and to every time I sit down to write, I have to feel all of my feelings about what it's gonna, what I'm putting down onto that paper and offering to others, and are they going to like it? And every time, it never goes away. I've been performing since I was 5. And every single time I have to perform, I have to go through the same process of emotions of fear and wanting to hide and all of that stuff. And I'm not good enough.
Mm.
It never goes away. For me, I feel for some people it might, but
And
yeah, it takes courage. Yeah, please.
yeah, just I mean, that sounds horrendous, right? Like,
It's really
it's kind.
not.
I mean, it's not. But if you just look at, just take that snapshot of all of those feelings, it's an intense
Right.
thing. So,
Yeah.
what? Obviously, there's something in the hierarchy of what you really want, what you're going for,
Mhm. Mhm.
um, that you want more than you don't want that
Mhm.
sort of those sort of feelings. Sorry,
Mhm.
one sec.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to
I'm
live in
just
a
yeah,
beautiful world.
yeah,
I want to live in a beautiful world, and I desire that more than I desire being safe. We'll put it that way.
yeah. And art is kind of
Right,
fundamental to that.
right.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
right.
Okay,
Hmm. Hmm.
okay. So there's the feelings, there's those feelings that are there, the challenges, the courage that was necessary for you. Just kind of focusing on your Substack, there was the college years that will not be named. But even writing an essay is different from writing, well, it's not so different, but like poetry. I'm just sort of curious, like where the fractals are. Like when did you write your first essay, for example, for your own expression, and what was it like to go from that? Well, yeah, well, even prior to Substack, and how did your Substack become a thing? How did you decide, like, oh, I'm going to write regular articles for people? And was there any ever doubt of whether you could pull that off? What did it demand of you to be able to create that?
Yeah, I'm glad that you asked that, because I did want to speak more to the virtuousness piece that I kind of brought up with the previous question. That came at the point when I realized that to offer my creations to the world was a virtuous act, and you know, an act of service beyond my own sort of individual ego, and also was profoundly healing to my ego, and crucial to my ego development and the ego development of others, was when the pandemic happened. And I had always been writing my entire life, and I had always been told that I was a talented writer, and I had never really taken myself seriously because I was tired of being the gifted child. So I wanted the privilege of being mediocre, right? Because I was one of those like gifted children that everyone expected, had really high expectations of, and I wanted to defy those expectations. I wanted to be the privilege of being mediocre. So I never really pursued the writing until it was like life or death, because the pandemic really shook everyone, quite obviously. It shook the whole world, and the way in which it shook me in my individual life was just how much I needed writing to stay sane. And that was the point when I realized I was keeping others sane by writing. I was keeping others sane by writing, and I was doing something. I was actually doing something. I was actually being impactful. And that was humbling for me, because it took my art to a level where it stopped being about myself, or it stopped being something that I did to like, previously it was something that I did to sort of like feel good, to feel a part of something, to feel seen, right? And when I started writing, initially I just started writing essays on Facebook, just not really thinking about, you know, I started writing about integral theory and gender politics and wokeness and queer ecology, and just all of the different things that fascinated me that were close to my heart. And the degree of and this is going to sound like a brag, but it's a bit of a brag. It's not a brag. It's just like, I just wish it wasn't. The degree of nuance that I was writing with at the time was surprisingly rare for a lot of people. And my work started getting shared more, and I realized after like about a year and a half, maybe 2 years of doing this on Facebook, I was like, I need to start getting paid for this, because it is the only skill I really have that's gonna keep me afloat in the capitalist system, is my writing.
Yeah.
And I started Substack, and I started taking myself more seriously, because I was like, if I'm going to keep doing this the way that I'm doing it, and I was being asked by whatever greater forces are interceding in my life, of which I'm sure there are many, that's my personal belief, want me to keep doing this, tell me to keep doing this, give me, I can see synchronous events happen in my life that communicate to me, keep doing this. If I'm going to keep doing this, I'm going to need to get something in return for it. I need support. you know, and so Substack was my way of allowing myself to have nourishment.
Mm.
And going beyond just survival, and being able to allow myself to actually hear that thank you, Scout, for giving us this, to actually hear that and be like, oh yeah, okay, I'm allowed to have that, you know. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting that you bring up the humble brag that's not a brag, but it's
Right.
true. Because it's
I
like
wish it wasn't. But
the first yeah, but yeah, the first time I heard you was I was actually I I began my own thing around the creative process and how am I going to speak to people online, and started adding people on Facebook, and I came across Joe Lightfoot, I think, and it was I'd said, oh, you seem really interesting, I'd love to speak with you to learn more about what you're doing and what you're creating,
Mhm.
and I think the day before I spoke with him, I jumped on his podcast to hear what he was doing, and I think it was an interview he did with you. I
Mhm.
think that was the first time I came across you, and I thought, oh wow, this what a rare what just a rare form of expression of so many different elements to culture and gender and artistry and spirit, and with this wonderful kind of rigor of, I wouldn't even say science, but you bring a lot of kind of clarity to what you talk about, um and that's rare. It really was rare, so it struck me immediately as like, oh wow, who is this person, and so it's lovely that that must have been almost 3 years ago itself. So
That was probably more than 3 years ago. Yeah, Lightfoot podcast.
yeah.
He stopped doing it about a year after that episode came out. And
Mm.
yeah.
um
Mm.
but yeah, so this kind of journey that you've described there of and mentioned, and really wanted to sort of, it's clear to you that this virtue was a really important part of going from having your own creative process as well, at least with writing, to making it an offering, that there was a threshold that you had to cross there.
Mhm.
And for you it sounded like that was to do with recognizing the inherent virtue,
Mhm.
and also that it's not about you.
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
I I think a lot of what people struggle with when it comes to creating is that, like, oh, what does this say about me? um and let's even speak to people who may, aren't as brilliant, because there is something, like, in a lot of us are mediocre at things
Oh
too.
my God.
But
Yeah.
I really mean it, because I'm like a big, and we've chatted about this in some way before, but like, there's kind of this cult of excellence, and I think one of the beautiful things about art is it really doesn't need to be excellent. In a way, there's something, well, one, and it kind of never is, there's
Mhm.
always something mediocre and average about everything that we're doing. And
Mhm.
if it's consistently not, then we'll get bored. That's
Mhm.
also the way. So kind of there's some themes here, kind of how do you, like, how does boredom fit into your creative process? How
Mhm.
does mediocrity slash excellence fit into it? And around all of that, how none of this is really about you.
Mhm. Well, I mean, being bored is hard. It's hard, but it's good for you because you know, I profoundly believe that it is boredom that sparks creativity, that sparks that desire. It's the dissatisfaction. Again, with like my I see the value in negation. I see a profound value in negation, in focusing on the empty space, right? And so when we're not having a pleasant experience of this, we go into lack, right? And we're taught that a lack mindset is unhealthy and that we should be framing things positively. And that's true, but we're skipping steps if we don't start with the negation. What's missing here? And then you can go towards, how do I create that, you know? But to be with the emptiness is the first step in the creative process. And that's why it's not for the faint of heart. That's why people who are profoundly grief stricken or struggle with depression or mental illness tend to gravitate towards the creative process, or why we see, you know, a lot of people will conflate artistry with mental illness, even though that's not the case at all. It's because that's something that, if you struggle with those things, you're more likely to be inclined to focus on, you know, what is missing here? Oh, I'm aching, you know, oh, I'm bored, like I'm not having a pleasant experience. Yeah, how do we create the experience that we actually want to be having in this moment? How do we identify how it's already here? How do we amplify it? These are important questions for the creative process. That's, you know, that's what I would have to say about boredom. Yeah, in my own life, I'm constantly seeking to escape boredom. You know, I'm constantly scrolling on my phone, looking to soothe an ache, right? But when I do that, it really negatively impacts my creative process. I create the most beautiful art when I am willing to sit with or be with or hold the tension, the friction, the discomfort that naturally arises just by the nature of being an embodied being, right? We get hungry, we get thirsty, we get horny, like we always want something. There's always something missing. And you know, we must seek those things. But before we start seeking them, we must exist with the lack of them. If that makes sense. I feel like I'm sort of repeating what I was speaking to earlier, but in a more direct, more human sense.
Yeah. No, I love that articulation, because it's always those 2 points. It's, you know, it's the vision and it's current reality, the lack of it, you know, and there's a tension that's born out of that. And from that tension drives creativity. And
yeah, it's creative tension.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I don't think I answered all of your questions, but that was the shiniest little bit within there. So that's what I took out.
Yeah. Well, I think it's so, and to be more specific, has there ever been a time where you can think of getting bored with your own creative patterns, if you like?
Yeah.
You know, where like, so we've kind of talked about boredom as a, you know, we escape boredom by scrolling, or we escape boredom, and actually in your creations, where, so I'll use an example in my own kind of as a writer or writing hip hop lyrics or things. I'm like, God, I'm so predictable right now, you know? And it's like, I think as creators, we can reach these, it's almost like cul-de-sacs or dead ends. And we're like, how do I get out of this? How do I kind of switch it up? And I think those moments can give birth or give rise to some really interesting artistic transitions that you can see in people's careers, or, you know, where they really go in a different direction. And all of the fans that love their old stuff feel really disappointed. And then like 2 years later, everyone's on board, you know? So yeah, just broadly speaking, anything that you notice from your own process of like feeling like you're in a bit of a creative rut, like you're creating, but it's not quite got what you're looking for from it. And then what do you do in those moments?
I can't speak for everyone, but I know what I've learned about my creative ruts is that they come in whenever I start making it about myself again. I'm trying to control the way that my art is perceived and received. And when, you know, and this is, so I have a monthly subscription-based group for creatives. It's called Courting Inspiration. And it is the intersection of like ritual, spiritual practice, and creative, expressive, you know, artistic thing is, and it's what can we learn from like the ancient bards of Wales, right? Who ultimately practiced invocation, and cultivated personalities based on other famous bards, right? They have this thing in the Welsh tradition which they call the chair, and what the chair is you sit in the other person's chair. So what it really means is you take on their persona, right? So you're no longer yourself.
Mm.
You become like an actor becomes the character, and the character becomes alive. And the best actors are the people who um, a lot of the, great actors have actually spoken to how they've been afraid that they lost themselves, they couldn't find themselves anymore. I think Tom Holland actually recently came out with how he played someone who had a what do they call it, dissociative identity disorder, and after that movie, he had to take a break and like focus on his mental health because he had
Wow. Yeah.
so deeply become that character that he was like, I'm gonna lose my mind if I don't, because to act is to invoke, is to become possessed voluntarily, right? Acting is actually a highly shamanic.
Hmm.
And I don't think a lot of people realize this. And so this is why the entertainers, and there's so much pain and exploitation going on in the entertainment industry, in part because these people are open channels, and the things that can move through them can be dangerous. They aren't. It's not the person, right? It's the way in which they can invite something other. And so, you know, well, that is to say, anytime I start to make the art about myself and I start to think, and I've observed this, I've observed the thought patterns whenever I'm in a creative rut. The blockage it's really a guardian, right? A guardian part. If you're familiar with parts theory and internal family systems and all of that, it is a protector part coming in to try to preserve something to keep me safe.
Mm.
And I don't know if it was you that posted this. I think it was you that posted this actually. It was a quote that said, "A lot of the artist's pain comes from avoiding the art." You may
Mm.
have, I think you may have posted it at some point, but I'm not sure who the originator of the quote is. Anytime I'm in a creative rut, it's due to being afraid of the art that actually wants to come
Right.
through, being afraid that I'll lose myself to it, that it'll destroy me, which is 100,000% a possibility and a perfectly reasonable thing to be afraid of and to be concerned about.
Yeah.
And this is where the ritual practices come in to hold me, to stabilize me so that I can sacrifice my ego, so that I can safely die, metaphorically
Right.
speaking, of course.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and become the art and then come back to myself afterwards. That's been
Yeah.
the longest periods of time in which I could be creative without going into a rut, I recently came out of a rut after not being in one for like several years. Because I started to get scared again of what was coming through, because it was so profoundly different from what I had been doing before.
I'd like to hear your thoughts on quality. Um, and this is a little bit tied into that question earlier of mediocrity versus excellence, and but really it's about the expectations often that we place upon ourselves. Um, I think one of the things that can hold people back from starting things is, oh, I'm not very good at that, or I'm not very good, and there's an expectation that they should be good, or that things only kind of need to be good in order to exist,
Mm.
or need to be excellent, or even the idea that, I think there's lots of ideas in our culture that kind of point to being exceptional in some way. It's like even ideas around creativity are, as long as combine two things that haven't been combined before, and then you make a new thing. And so you people are sort of on the lookout for creating something exceptional. And from the perspective of business or entrepreneurship, like maybe all of those things have their place. Um, but I think strictly, well, just looking at that question as creators, people that, and when I say creators, I really mean just as humans, right? Like you're a human, you have this creative capacity, and there's so much that can uh, kind of so much of life that can reveal itself to you through being engaged in that, more directly engaged with your creative capacity. And often these ideas of expectation or quality or excellence or something that stands out in some way can really hinder that journey. So I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on that. Maybe, and it may be generally or it may be personally, but yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, for me, this ties into like things like racial programming and internalized misogyny, funny enough, where you're told that you're inferior and then you're told that you have to prove you're not. And it's all internalized too. So you're told that those people think that you're inferior. And in some situations that you have experiences where, those people that actually do treat you like you're inferior. But in my personal experience, I've not experienced a direct, you can't do this because you're Black or because you're female or anything. I've experienced fear and anxiety from protective people that I was raised around, that I would be treated that way. And so I have to preemptively make up for the fact that I'm inevitably going to be treated this way by proving myself. And it's very deeply embedded in yeah, and a lot of sort of like what people call today marginalized groups, not a term I prefer, but people know what I'm talking about when I say that. So that's what I'll say. But it's really present in everyone, right? Because you have like what is not considered a marginalized group today, right? Like a straight white man, right? Where like the cultural programming of the straight white man is, oh, the other men are gonna steal your girl, you'd better get swole, like you'd better outperform, right? You'd better not have feelings, you'd better be so stoic, right? So everyone gets fed it in this different way. My way happens to be unique to my cultural background, but ultimately we have a wider culture globally. The Western world, or the weird world, as people are starting to call it these days. There's a particular type of cultural competition. I don't think a cultural competition inherently has to be toxic. I think competition is incredibly healthy and incredibly necessary, right? That's that creative tension we were talking about. If you see two lion cubs play fighting, you'll understand what I'm speaking to when I say competition can be healthy. But we have a particular style of cultural competition in which it is like, I'm not competing with you to steel man you. I'm not competing with you to make you a better version of yourself. I'm competing with you to take you down, because if I don't, I won't survive. Right. And so that's different. And so that is an underlying mentality in the collective unconscious that is causing us to believe that we are only allowed to make art if other people will pay us for it, if other people will consume it, if it's better than everyone else's, instead of we do this just because this is a part of who we are. That's like if we said, I can only breathe if I'm gonna do something with my breath, right? If I'm not gonna do something worth pay $300 with my exhale, I'm not gonna inhale, right? That's ridiculous, right? Who would have, why would you, I'm not gonna eat until I mean, I had this, content warning for people who might have eating disorders, but when I had struggled with the eating disorders myself, and appetite problems and all of this stuff, my relationship with food, in general, I would have this voice inside of my head telling me, you didn't go outside today, why do you need food, right? Or you didn't do this, or you didn't do that, like why would you need food? Like you don't need to consume or to have or be nourished unless you are planning to do something with it, right? And it's like the doing
Mm.
something is my existence, right? Just by nature of my existence, like I need nourishment. Um, and if I'm going to do something, I just need extra nourishment, right? Like more than my baseline. And that's okay. Art is nourishment, creating is nourishment. And it is an instinctual thing that we do. It's an expression of life. Life is one of those things that is for its own sake, right? Um, so if to be creative is to express is one of the ways that life expresses itself. This is all throughout the animal kingdom. You can argue it goes beyond the animal kingdom. Um, then we need to do it, and we need to not worry about if we're good at it. And if we're going to compete about it, we should be doing that competition in order to inspire each other, right? Like playing a sport, right? I like Magic the Gathering. It's a competitive card game, right? And I'm not very good at strategy. So if I'm going to be playing Magic the Gathering, I'm playing to lose, but I'm playing to learn too. I'm playing to have fun for the challenge, right? And the nourishment that comes with the challenge. If I wanted to go and play it competitively so that I could win prizes, it would destroy me. Right? I'm doing it because competition could be a way to bond, to create intimacy. And if we're going to be, incorporating that in the creative process with other humans, we need to center it. It should really be a means to an end of creating greater connection and expressing
Hmm.
life.
Yeah, as opposed to this kind of justification of like,
Right.
yeah, I mean, needing to justify anything's
Right.
creation.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's okay for the truly excellent to rise above the others. It is okay for that. It's like you have your scouts, right? Who they only walk in front of everyone else. And this is actually why I named myself this. They walk in front of everyone else to see things that the others wouldn't be able to see and alert them so that the others could do their jobs more effectively, right? The scout's not in
hmm
front because the scout is better than the other humans. The scout is in front because it's their job
hmm
um, to go before everyone else, to be in the front, to be in the lead, to take certain risks, right? And so people who are excellent, right, who are give themselves permission to rise above, inspire the others to rise in their own ways. So we shouldn't be, getting rid of these disparities and trying to make everyone is just as good as everyone else. No, that's fucking ridiculous. Everyone has a talent and a gift and a sacred purpose and a reason for being here. At least that's my personal belief. Um, and not everyone's is the same. And
hmm
so we need to be I tend to pursue relationships where I might feel jealous of the other person or I might feel threatened by them because it invites me to understand how my value is different from theirs and how their value is different from mine and how can we actually collaborate in being in generating that creative tension through our differences to ultimately create a more beautiful world, which is the purpose of
yeah,
the artist as we spoke to earlier.
yeah, yeah. I think that's the lived dimension of art. Is so often this discomfort, and in relating with other people that maybe you feel jealous of, or in standing next to someone who is excellent in something that you love, and it's only highlighted when you're there kind of in comparison. And it's not that you're to be compared, and yet it can really feel like that at the time. And yet there's a dimension of that that can really stimulate and drive you forward, and born of not even, in that case, not even healthy competition, but just being in the ecosystem of creators. And yeah, um where yeah, so you mentioned learning, and these are kind of I think learning is fascinating. It's one of those things that is supposedly a big part of our lives, and sometimes it's so easy to be like, I think, kind of wonder, like, did I learn anything at school? Like, what did I learn? Where am I engaged in learning? And so, okay, so two things: so learning and discipline. I'd
Mhm.
be really curious to hear your thoughts on what those mean to you as a
Mm.
as a creator and as someone who has ambitions and aspirations.
Mm. Yeah, this is a challenging question for me. We'll see what comes through. Because discipline and commitment are challenging words for me. And they're words that
Yeah.
I am, I'm currently in my Saturn return. So of course these words are, and the way in which they challenge me are particularly shiny and alive for me these days, and probably will be for the next year and a half. As we're halfway through my Saturn return. Because there's the discipline that is enforced upon you by an external authority whose sole drive is to have power over, right?
Mm-hmm.
The discipline of the church, right? The nun smacking the child with a
Yeah.
thingy against,
Yeah.
the knuckles for not for being a person, right?
Yeah.
And then there's then there's the commitment, like you can be committed to a mental hospital, right? So there's that kind of commitment and that kind of discipline. And then there's the commitment that serves devotion.
Mm-hmm.
There's that I am going to make myself do this because ultimately I'm devoted to this other thing. So commitment is what we sign up to do, what we do, even if we don't feel like doing it. And devotion is what we cannot help but do. We cannot help but
Beautiful.
love that we do, and so they work together because the commitment is what keeps you in devotion, and devotion is what inspires you to have the resolve to commit when you might be tempted to give up.
Mm.
And the discipline comes in there with the commitment to kind of say, all right, so we're going to have to sometimes talk ourselves into doing what we love, right? Or
Yeah, yeah.
loving or into, right, if you ever had like a long-term relationship, or if you have a challenging familial relationship, but I have some challenging familial relationships that I continuously bring me back to this, like, how do I want to show up regardless of what this other person is doing. It kind of ties back into virtue as well, and
Mm.
living in alignment with one's values. How do I want to show up in this moment? I have a choice. And with the creative practices, there will be days where you're just like, fuck this. I'm like, I don't want to, I'm going to delete my Substack. Like, I'm just going to get a normal job. Like, I don't want to start throwing a tantrum, right? And then the father in me, my internal, paternal, my internal paternal. That's good. I'm gonna write that down.
Yeah.
My internal paternal self comes in to kind of like be stern and loving and say, yes, you are throwing a tantrum right now, and I understand why, and that's perfectly okay, but you need to clean your fucking room, like like I love you, and clean your room, or go wash the dishes, like just do it, man, like
Right, right.
and those things are important in earlier you asked a question about routine and ritual and daily life and how that sort of relates to the creative force and honoring the creative force within me. And it's like, yeah, all of the parts of my one of my mentorships that I recently launched is called Living Altar Mentorship. And it's essentially the purpose of this mentorship is to turn your life into an altar, into a living work of art, right? And how to show up in every moment as much as possible in that creative practice, and treating all the elements of your life like they are a creative practice. And so that's not easy, right? That's not easy work. You're gonna zone out, you're gonna dissociate, you're gonna go back into the rat race, you're gonna your addictions will come in and they will tempt you. It's not fun if you don't have the I did a video recently on the devil card in the tarot and how important that figure is
Uh-huh.
for making the process of being alive fun, right? Because every good
Hmm.
myth needs an adversary, and if something's not brushing up against us, trying to say, hey, you don't really need to do the right thing right now. You don't really need to, that's you can just have as many cupcakes as you want, right? Just who cares if you
Yeah,
get
yeah, yeah.
sick? You'll get sick later. Right now, it'll feel good, right? We need that so that we have a chance to say no, as opposed to if we are being
Hmm.
forced to say no. No, I can't do that. We have to say, I'm choosing not to do that because I want to choose something else. I want to choose virtue. I want to devote to my creativity. So I'm going to make this commitment. I'm going to be disciplined X, Y, Z. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. No, a beautiful answer, and it's I love that. Really, what comes through there is choice. It's choice and devotion and desire. That there's this thing that I want, and I want it more than this other thing.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And
Exactly.
and also not all is lost if I, on occasion, do want the
Right.
other thing. It,
Yeah.
and
The devil gets lonely, and I think that we need to go hang out with him sometimes and say,
right.
say thank you. Thank you for your polarity that you provide in this experience of life.
Yeah, I mean, it's so, this coming from like, you know, young white male stoic, like, what were the archetypes that I was looking at of like when I was growing up or thinking, okay, I want to be a creator or an entrepreneur or whatever the thing, the sort of typical archetypal stoic doesn't give in to whim or, or lust, or whatever the things are.
That's adorable.
It's like, it's just sort it really, it kind of makes me chuckle where I'm at now because they're just totally different channels and they, you can kind of dance between them. But the way that I viewed it at one point was, as though you kind of had to really kind of ultimately or absolutely change something or conquer something in order to, and yet all of these, the amazing thing is that actually, and the funny thing is, sorry, I'm going all over the place here, but the funny thing is that if you look at artists' lives, many of the artists that have kind of made a huge amount of impact on, our lives and culturally. I mean, they're a mess, and they don't have to be a mess. It's not that that's a necessary point, but it's like in the sanitized world that we have right now, it's so easy to think, oh, I'm a mess, and relative to the messes that were some of these people, you're not a mess. Even that, you're not a mess. But it's like it gets so clean and sanitized, and this idea that everything really has to be orderly in order to create, and yet you've got these immensely powerful creators that are always dancing with the devil in some way, and yet they're also attending to their devotion. And so what I think is well, I think that can show us is that you can really cultivate both. You can really cultivate your creative practice and become quite a powerful creator in one channel. And you can also have all of your human foibles and difficulties kind of at the same time because they're kind of these separate channels. And you get to what you learn in one can be transferred to the other. And I think that's one of the beautiful things um, about having a place where you get to explore those ideas of learning and discipline and creation and devotion and showing up anyway, you know, that it kind of gives you a reference point as to where else in your life you can do the same thing. And if there's stuff you want to talk to there, feel free to go back to it. But I
Mhm.
kind of had this question as well, because I know that you made a move recently from New York to North Carolina or something like that.
Yes. Yeah, I'm currently living in Asheville, North Carolina, from Brooklyn, New
Right.
York. It's where I made the
Okay.
pilgrimage.
And I don't know if that's the first time in your life you really moved or left the city, but it, it was just an interesting point to make an inquiry on for me to see if what about your creative process and practice helped you or informed the way you made that move. Because it sounds like whenever we move, especially if it's a big one, there's this genuine leap into the unknown. um, there's a pattern that's being broken. There's perhaps like a boredom that's being acknowledged. There's a lot of the different threads that we've covered in this conversation, maybe at play, and maybe
Mhm.
not, you know.
Mhm.
But yeah, I'm curious to hear what you have to say on that.
Mhm. In my courting inspiration group, we focus on these four pillars, right, of inspiration practice, and they're essentially just ways of being in the world. Very simple. We're all already doing them. It's just about um, doing them more and more and more intentionally. And so they are emptying, listening, filling, and offering. And with something like moving to Asheville, North Carolina, which, it's in the South, it's like I'd only been here for the first time last fall. Um, and because of my practice of listening, I was actually able to hear the actual, and this is again with being kind of like a visionary mystic type, this is how I experience the world. Coming here and hearing the mountain tell me, this is your home. Hearing those words in my head
Mm.
and actually being able to say, okay, I believe you.
Right.
Right? Yeah, is like because of and before this, I cultivated a practice of listening um in my songwriting, right? Songwriting practice. So one of my best friends started a songwriting competition almost 5 years ago now, probably more than 5 years ago at this point. Every week you write a song based on a theme, and then they vote on a winner. And it started as a joke of like, the joke is that by the law of large numbers, if we write a song every week, uh, for the rest of our lives, one of them has to become a top 40 hit. That's the joke. That
Okay.
started the songwriting competition. And it's been, there have been some core members that have been a part of it for as many years as it's been a thing. And a lot of the
Wow.
friends, I've made friends through this group, right? That are still friends, still important people in my life. And through practicing this, I learned, it's okay to make bad art. It's okay to make mediocre art. The things like how commitment is what stabilizes our devotion, right? And all
Hmm.
of these different things, and also the virtue of offering, right? And these four pillars kind of revealed themselves to me through that practice, and the listening piece in particular, because you get to a point where you're like, I got to write another song this week. Like, how am I going to do it? How are you going
Yeah,
to do
yeah.
it, right?
Complete unknown. Like, where's that going
Yeah,
to come from?
where does it, yeah, exactly. The next natural step is when you question yourself like that is, well, where does my art really come from? And that you immediately start listening for it when you ask yourself that question. That's just what
Mm.
somatically, that's just what happens. Your body starts to open, your like the pores of your soul start to open and drink in. And the more I started to do that on a consistent basis, the more would come in, to the point where I could hear a mountain tell me to move to Asheville, North Carolina, right? Because the
Yeah.
inspiration practice, to inspire is to it comes from the Latin word, which means to bring in the life force, right, through the breath.
Mm.
Divine inspiration. If you've ever played D&D, the bard's special power, divine inspiration, you're calling the gods to you, right? This is actually inspired by the practices that the actual bards would do too. Is you're calling the gods to you, you're invoking something beyond yourself into yourself, and this is applicable beyond the artistic realm, or what we define as the artistic realm, which is just,
Yeah.
oh, I'm gonna paint, I'm gonna write a song, right? The artistic realm is your entire life, and when you see it that way, mountains start talking to you.
Yeah, yeah.
uh,
It's so beautiful. Yeah, I mean, it's so great. It's one of the things that I'm kind of so interested in exploring here, where it's like it's a bit of a ruse, really, because it's not just about, isn't, it's not just about the arts or whatever. And
yeah.
yet it through that we start to see the layers so often as how the same things apply. It's kind of like a fractal at the level you can get your head round, and then all of a sudden it's like once you start building familiarity with that tension, then it starts showing up in other places. And I love that answer as well, and to hear how you've been in structures where you're creating a song every week. And whether we call it kind of a ritual space, a container, or, in some way, there's structures that are set up where we're there by choice. And that's there. We're there by choice and devotion. There's genuine desire. There's no obligation. You don't have to create the song. But as long as you want to create the song, then there's this fascinating kind of dynamic that you're aware of. It's like, oh, it's coming, and I have no idea where it's going to come from. I know that. So for me personally, I think one of the places that I really enjoyed expressing my creativity were just people's birthdays. And, it's such a simple thing. And yet it exists in time. There's a point in time. Um, and there's a tension because it's coming. And the closer you get and the less you have created, that tension increases, and it's through that so much inspiration gets born. And one of the most amazing dynamics, I think, in a creative process or as an artist when you start to trust and know from experience. You're like, I don't know where this week's song's going to come from, but it's going to come. you know and it might even look, maybe you are even a bit anxious about it, but that it doesn't really matter. It's like it's gonna, the structure's in place, you want to do it, and the rest somehow sort of seems to work itself out. um yeah, I think, it's really interesting for me to hear that as well, because I would consider myself, the kind of, I love creating. My dream was to build this little cabin, um own a little piece of land and build a cabin. And I've always loved working with wood, and feel incredibly fortunate enough to have been able to do it. And, and part of the dream was, oh, I'll build this cabin and I'll just, I'll have my own space and I'll be able to write and, make hip hop songs, do everything. And the reality, I'm 9 years into it now, and it's like, oh wow, it's hard. It's
Right,
hard
yeah.
to do all of
Well,
this stuff.
it's only after 9 years that you can admit that to yourself.
Yeah. It's so funny. And I think what's interesting is that for anyone who's listening that maybe doesn't have time and space, the quote unquote ideal amount of time and space that they would like for their creative life, it's not the time and the space often. And that's not to say it's not a real factor. Like, having space and having time is, it's a big part of it, but it's really developing these creative muscles that we've been talking about that allow you to make the most of the time and space that you have. It's not just this case, at least that I found, where, oh, I no longer have any commitments, and zero structure. And
Yikes.
oh god, I mean, that's
Right,
a real recipe for like overwhelm. And
right.
and so it's actually some of these constraints and limitations, and really developing all of these muscles that we've been talking about. So
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. No commitments. Oh man, I get bored. I do get bored. Whenever I like fuck off of my responsibilities, I feel like sick, physically ill. And it hurts worse than doing the actual commitments. The commitments hurt in a way that's profoundly nourishing,
Mm.
sort of like a workout, right? You don't want to do the workout probably when you are about to go do it, but that's part of the fun of it, right? That's a part of the process. That's a part of the mythos, if you will, right?
Mm-hmm.
Of becoming the person that I would even say invoking the person that you're trying to become, right? Um, and yeah, I mean, people don't have to be as crazy as me, right? And fully just like live this mystical, strange life at the intersection of like a visionary experience and and poetry, right? They don't like I'm in it. I wouldn't recommend this to anyone. Um, because it's a very unconventional way of being, and it's hard to trust, especially in our culture. But you don't have to make the sacrifices that I've chosen to make. You don't have to um, choose between life fully devoted to this like chaotic creative force that asks you to sometimes do things that make no sense and are deeply challenging to your ego, and you know, like going to Ireland in 7 weeks with like barely any money in your bank account. Like, yeah, don't do that. um, that's just a little joke for you that you can cut out because no one's gonna get it.
No, 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 no. I'd love to. Let's go there.
Yeah. Well, I'll finish
So I
by
think that.
saying you can create tiny spaces, because any amount of space that you create for this creative life force to really for yourself to identify it more fully and to notice how it's already there. Any tiny little bit of space, if you have kids, if you have a 9 to 5, like 1 hour a day, 15 minutes a day is more than enough.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have to be this like, oh, I'm Lady Gaga now, right? Like, or anything like that. Um,
Yeah,
there's nuance.
and you can't leap to that really. Like you
Yeah.
go through the 15 minutes, go through the 5, go through 30 seconds, like start to open up whatever little spaces and time frames that you can.
Mhm.
Because again, it's all about that choice, and it's far too convenient to think that we don't have choice because we're so far away from what we think of is the ideal, the necessary conditions. And actually, I think if creating teaches you anything, it's that the circumstances are just one of the conditions, or a number of them, but they're not
Mhm.
the only thing that's at play. Because there's this other curious, mysterious force that, is
Mhm.
beyond words, that's also at play. And that when you kind of start working with that by virtue of your choice and commitment and devotion, um, curious things can happen.
Mhm. Magical things.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So I'd love to wrap up by talking about Ireland, because I think that that's a really, there's a lot there. You mentioned Wales and the bardic tradition, and
Mhm.
feel
Mhm.
free to, well, what is it that you're going for? And
Mm.
as far as what, yeah, what
Mhm.
what about Ireland has kind of, I don't know, sparked the kindling of your desire of
Mhm.
sorts? Like, why is going there
Mm. Mhm.
um
Mhm.
on this side of it? Because that's always so interesting as well. Like, there's the vision that we have for it, and then there's reality,
Mhm.
and it can always,
Mhm. Mhm.
well, so much stuff can happen in between. So at this stage, before you go,
Mhm.
what you, uh, yeah, what's driving you?
Um, I'm a poet. And the intersection of poetry and spirituality first made itself known to me through my sort of fascination with um, Irish mythology and songs and culture, which has always had a shininess and an appeal to me, but hasn't landed for me in a way that it would if I were actually on that soil, if that makes sense. Because, and I think this is true of to steal a word from Tada Hazumi, who's a little bit of a controversial public intellectual figure, a cultural body, right, is the way in which a particular bioregion and the people who, over extended periods of time, you can be indigenous to a place, you can become indigenous to a place as well. It's indigeneity is a little bit slipperier than we like to say it is these days. Cultivating a relationship with a particular bioregion, culture emerges from that relationship. Cultural practices and religions emerge from that relationship. Belief systems emerge from that relationship. And you have so that's what a cultural body is. And you have cultural bodies and they can speak to one another, and have primarily African ancestry. And the ways in which the cultural body that I come from and the cultural body of the Irish people have danced over history, having similar experiences with colonization, having things like the drum being central to the drum is central to a lot of places, but like having the drum be central to and rhythm and all of that be central to the way of speaking to each other through song, through dance, all of these things, the ways in which in the Americas those cultural bodies came together to create things like tap dancing, and folk music. um, there is something there. I'm called to liminal spaces, and this is a particular liminal space, a place where two cultural bodies have had a long-standing romance that
Mm,
has come in and honestly saved my life and has offered me profound healing. And it feels like a chance to offer back something and to learn more from the people, from the land, of what is actually being stirred in me. As a poet, Ireland is a place where poetry is quite dear and intrinsic to the cultural identity and the history and all sorts of things, and the spirituality, right? And so being a sort of poet that's also a religious scholar, it really only makes sense, right? uh, there's a tug here. There's a lot of mystery behind it too. There's a lot that I don't know yet about why this is emerging for me, but it's been emerging slowly for a long time. And so I have a feeling this is going to be an important step in my mystical path, but also in my capacity to offer to others, um, and reflect back their own magic. If that makes
mm.
sense.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's uh, geography is so kind of wild in that way. Like, we're always somewhere, and but there are places that call to us, and I'm really, yeah, I'm really intrigued to see what emerges from it. Um,
Me too.
yeah, in the case that anyone's listening would like to support your adventure, then I will post a link when this goes live. And yeah, and then kind of to round things up, anything that you want to share about where people can find you? Yeah, there's sort of all of those all of those things.
Okay, sure. Well, so my Substack, which we talked about, is called Hyperphantasia. It's a reference to a condition where the imagination is vivid enough to drive you insane. And there I publish my prose poetry. I talk a little bit about the offerings and the one-to-one sort of mentorship work that I do, any talks I might be giving. This podcast is probably going to go, once it's published, it's going to go on there. I do collective messages as well, which are like divinatory prose poems meant to actually be used for inspiration or for actual guidance. You know, there might be synchronicities in there for people. There might be like some kind of, it's meant to speak to their intuition and what they already, you know, might be pulled towards. You can also follow me on social media. I don't exactly post super duper often the meaty juicy stuff on there, but if you want to like see my more playful side, and my taste in memes, I have been told is exquisite, and so if that's more what you're into, you can follow me on either Facebook or Instagram or both. If you're local to Asheville, which maybe somebody watching this might be in the Asheville area, I do in-person workshops with regarding like movement, ritual movement practice too. So yeah, so if people are curious about me, Substack's the best place, but I'm also everywhere and nowhere.
Yeah, gosh, as a kind of final bonus question, I'd love to hear about connections that you've made as being a creator. You know, obviously like we're connecting now despite having kind of crossed paths in some way, but we're creating something is being born out of this. And yeah, I'll just say that I think for any time that we're living in, I think as humans, the kind of more creative muscles that people bring to the table, they're sort of cooler things that can happen, you know. And we're at a time where everyone's got a perspective or opinion about stuff that needs to happen. And yet, you know, at the very essence of it, I think what allows stuff to happen, to emerge, to get created is often relationships between people that have an idea to create something and have the capacity to do so. So I love that final note on people that may find you in Ashland, but just any kind of closing words on the relationships and how being a creator has kind of formed and has steered your life with other people.
All of my most profound connections have been creative collaborations in some way. They have been, and this didn't become clear to me until later, and I'm saying a lot of this in hindsight too, but it's also possible that it's more so this way now because I'm more devoted to the, you know, practice of being a living altar, as I would phrase it, or yeah, turning my life into art as caveat magister. One of my connections that I found through the internet and through the being a creator, his book Turn Your Life into Art is a really great sort of, it's partially methodical, partially personal storytelling, but he talks about the ways in which to perform psychomagic in your own life. And yeah, really this creative, this devotion to creative expression, and the beautification of the world brings into my life relationships that are profoundly magical, that are frustratingly outside of my control, that are highly mysterious in their nature. And this is important for me. This is an important humility piece for me as a tarot reader. Is agnosia is the word that I think some Christian mystics would use to describe intentionally forgetting, intentionally not knowing, intentionally unknowing, in order to have the truth be revealed to you. A greater truth than you might have been able to perceive if you thought you knew, or you even, you know, thought you could know, right? And so these relationships, I feel them as being profoundly creative. And even if it's as small as like we build something together, we create a cute little dopey song together on a hike or something like that, or we just create an experience together. But most of my relationships, I'm surrounded by creative collaborators, you know, be it I've been meeting a lot of musicians lately here in Asheville. I've been developing courses with friends. I've been just um, the profound love, the way that the love presses against the business, you know, aspect of it is something I wish for everyone, because I know that there are people that feel like they've got to outsource and they've got to sacrifice, and it sucks that we live in a system that encourages that and that makes it harder to not do that. But I'm profoundly
What
blessed
do you mean
to
by
be
outsource in this
um
respect?
to give one's creative force to someone else, right? So rather than having it
Aha.
be an authentic expression of who they are and what their purpose actually is in this world, in this finite life, they'll they'll harness it and they'll put it towards something that's not really fulfilling to them and actually might even actively harm the
Right.
world, you know. And so, you know, this sort of like joke meme situation about bullshit jobs, I would say, is a
Yeah.
manifestation of that, probably the most relatable manifestation of that. And that's not to say all 9 to 5 like normal quote unquote jobs are that. It's just that
Sure.
a lot of people are doing that, and they're motivated by fear in doing that, and they're justified in doing that because it appears on the surface that that is the most stable thing to do, that is the most responsible thing to do. I'm profoundly blessed that I have a lot of support in my life and that I was raised by weirdos.
Yeah.
I'm more willing and I'm more able to pursue a very strange path that I don't even fully
Mm.
understand. And I wish that for everyone. I wish everyone was able to do that. I think that's the way that it should, quote unquote, be. I'm getting off on a little bit of a tangent here, but
No, I really, I think it's such a kind of strong illustration, if you like, of what a lot of people are really seeking. You know, it's like we're really seeking those. We're seeking community. We're seeking meaning, and yet even those two words, meaning and community, kind of become abstractions that aren't necessarily. It's hard to tell what they are, and yet as soon as you have an actual vision of a creation, oh, let's make a song, you know, it's like, oh,
mm-hmm.
you know, the skills and abilities related to that venture emerge or get created or learn, or you know, and I think it's kind of a bit of my own opinion, but when I think of friendships outside of artistic collaboration of sorts,
Mm-hmm.
everyone's working their own job, and then they get together, and it's a bit like Friends, you know, on the TV show, and it's kind of like it's that's what consumer culture is born out of, kind of friends hanging out together, consuming stuff together,
Right.
and that's, you know, that's cool, that's fine as well, and yet it's a very different. It's boring. It gets to a point where it's boring as
Mm-hmm.
well.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there are a lot of bored people and there are a lot of people that want to do stuff. And I'll say, at least some of the space that I see as far as like entrepreneurship goes and be a solopreneur, it can be quite isolationist, and you feel like you've got to do it all by yourself in some way.
Mm-hmm.
And yet I think the arts are such a rich example of people coming together to put something on, you know, and then it disbands and maybe they don't see each other for years, and yet the connections that get built out of that are really kind of, I mean, as you've spoken to, some in some way, in hindsight, in retrospect, you can go, wow, they're really quite powerful bonds between you and people in that way.
Mm-hmm.
um
The deepest bonds, I would argue, are created through through art, through collaboration, through shared work.
hmm,
Yeah, because it is probably one of the most primal, you know, I mean, it's like sex, shared work, and like child rearing are like some of the
right.
most primal. and fighting, really, honestly, too.
Yeah.
Play fighting, or rough housing. Probably the four most primal for ways of connecting to someone. But shared work is in there.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think people realize how intimate collaboration
Totally. And
is.
yeah, I mean, I've never heard it quite so succinctly put, but absolutely, it really is. And and with that other element involved, not the outsourcing type, even though that also counts, it does also count as shared work and the bonds that created
Right.
from that. But when you have this kind of alignment between your real desire and your chosen desires and your devotion and all of those things, and then you add in the shared work, it's really nourishing at levels that I think are quite foreign to a lot of people, and is it's just funny because we live in an age where there's so much abundance and so much lack in that regard, and you sort of start to realize, like, oh wow, I mean, I could have a fraction of this abundance if those, if you have the good sex, the good shared work, these kind of things, if the pillars are there, then suddenly you can live an extremely fulfilled life. And it's all kind of tied to that creative spirit and recognizing that in and of itself is an animating force in the human experience, and it can do a lot for you. Not that it needs to do anything for you, but if you want to play with it, it'll play with you.
Well said.
Cool, Scout. All right. Well, thank you very much. If there's any last words, feel free.